look at 100% pesticide reduction mark. There was individual cases again that showed no yield loss, and others all the way up to total yield loss, where there was 100%. And this means that even though we can determine an average figure from this data, such as an average yield loss of 15% when pesticides are reduced by 50%, what this average figure is masking is all that variation that can occur in those different scenarios. What that means for us is that we can't use that figure, that average figure, in an impact analysis, because it would totally underestimate the loss for some situations and overestimate it in others.
Over the past few weeks, numerous tillage events have taken place across the country. These events provide a great opportunity for farmers not only to gain valuable insights, but also to connect with neighbours and friends to discuss shared challenges and interests. Did you manage to attend any meetings locally or further afield? You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. The National Tillage Conference was held on Wednesday, January 29th, featuring excellent presentations and engaging workshop sessions that tackled some of the key issues facing farmers today. I'm delighted today to be joined by Meghan England and Robert McDougall, both researchers in Teagasc, who presented valuable research at the conference. They explored the use of integrated pest management, the reduction of pesticide use, and the potential impact on growers in the future. To start, I asked Meghan why this research was so important.
Reducing the use of pesticides is a very prevalent and important topic right now, especially in regards to the sustainability of farming. The reason this research was needed was specifically related to the EU's farm to fork strategy, where they have set out targets for reducing pesticides by 50% by the year 2030 for all member states. So Ireland, as a member state of the EU, need to address this. And this is where our project, IPM 2030, comes in. One of our tasks is to conduct an economic impact analysis on how these reductions will affect the sustainability of Irish cropping systems. Unfortunately, there is little real-life data available on the impacts of pesticide reduction for Ireland. So to address this, we started by turning to the existing global research to see if we could take any insights from what other countries have found and determine if they would be relevant to us here in Ireland.
So all of those, Meghan, the global research you mentioned, they're published scientific papers that are out there for anybody to read.
Correct. Yeah. So it's all published scientific papers that are available on scientific databases, Google Scholar, as well as databases like Scopus and Web of Science. And what we did was just a systematic review. We plugged in some keywords into those databases that were specific to what we wanted to find. And search for any papers that kind of hit the mark in regards to their summaries and their titles. It threw back like 5,000 sources back to us that matched our keywords. So so this is research that's all been done over you can put in limits for years and locations, but we didn't. We just did a broad search based on keywords.
So for the most part, the search was based around integrated pest management and the reduction of pesticides in a general sense. That's kind of pretty much and both of those had to be connected.
Yeah. So the initial search, we were quite broad. We're looking at impacts of pesticide reduction in agriculture, cropping systems, and specifically we wanted to look at economic impacts, environmental impacts, as well as even social sustainability type impacts. So anything that hit those keywords came back to us in our initial search. But as I said, there was over 5,000 sources there that we had to narrow down to find the ones that specifically looked at what we wanted. So we had quite a strict selection criteria for the studies to include, and we ended up narrowing the 5,000 down to 52 sources. And we did this because the source had to quantify the impact of pesticide reduction on one of three categories. It was crop income, crop yield, or environmental or social sustainability outcomes. And they had to measure a reduced pesticide scenario compared to a baseline, like a conventional cropping system, where farmers, that mimics their current use of pesticides, basically. So comparing the two systems, there was quite a bit of research on that, but another thing we had to exclude on was not necessarily integrated pest management. There was quite a few studies that did use IPM and we were able to use them. But what we had to exclude on was studies that measured more than one variable, like more than just pesticide reduction, because there was a lot of papers that looked at different farming systems and compared them. And even though they looked at pesticide reduction and might have measured crop yield or crop income, they were also looking at changes in fertilizer or changes in management in that style. And they didn't separate the results between the two. So we had no way of knowing how much of the change was due to the pesticide reduction or to the other factors.
Okay, so more than one variable in it, really, and you were only trying to focus on one variable being the reduction in pesticides.
Yeah, just so that we had the confidence in the results we were using, so that we knew it was specifically pesticide reduction that result had come from.
Okay, and obviously, or I'm not saying obviously, but you mentioned, I think, in your presentation that there were review papers from Ireland considered in this. Were there many that made the cut, or even from similar types of climates to Ireland?
So in the final number of sources that we used, no, none were actually from Ireland. So they didn't make the final cut, unfortunately. But this really highlighted what we said in the beginning, that there is a large knowledge gap and that we don't have this information for Ireland. Of the 52 studies we used, 32 of them were from European countries, many of which are classified in the same climatic zone as Ireland. So we have used them as a proxy. However, we would also suggest that Ireland has its own unique climate with its own distinct pest challenges, and that what could happen in countries within similar climatic zones wouldn't necessarily mimic what we would experience here. So while the European data can provide a guide, it can't be used to say exactly that this is what we would see here.
Okay, so in terms of results, then, so you've brought all the papers together. You're down to 52, I think, is what you said.
Yeah.
What were the main results then from the study?
Yep. So the first main result of the study was actually the limited amount of data that was available to be used. It really highlighted the knowledge gap and that the answers we were trying to find weren't actually out there, which is a common remark that the research has been done, we just need to find it. But for us, this wasn't the case. From the data that we did get, the findings were, starting with yield, that the majority of results found yield to decrease with pesticide reduction. 85% in fact found this, while income-related results were more evenly split, with 56% finding income to decrease with pesticide reduction, while 42% actually found them to increase. So this can be due to reduced costs by using less pesticides and fluctuating commodity prices. But this shows that the relationship between income and pesticide reduction is not quite as clear as the one we saw for yield. For environmental and social outcomes, the majority of results were as we'd expect. There was 73% positive, meaning that they showed there was less environmental harm, such as less toxicity to the environment, less risk to human health when less pesticides were used. However, 22% of these environmental outcomes, they actually worsened with pesticide reductions, meaning there was a negative effect on the environment when pesticides were reduced. These ones were more related to increases in fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions, which would be relevant in scenarios, for example, where herbicides are reduced and the alternative pest management techniques would require more machinery use, such as extra cultivations or mechanical weeding. So that actually highlights, even though there is a lot of good outcomes for the environment with reducing pesticides, we still need to be careful on a case-by-case basis of what outcomes can occur from the changes in management.
When you mentioned the case-by-case scenarios there, was it relatively consistent, or was there a bit of variability in the results that you were looking at?
For the yield data, we were able to run a regression analysis which quantifies the relationship between yield impacts and pesticide reduction. And we found a significant relationship between the two, which indicates that as pesticide use reduces, yield does too. However, while this result was statistically significant, it was a very weak relationship, and this is due to the variation that you mentioned there. So we had quite a large variability within the yield results. For example, if we look at where our data sat at a 50% pesticide reduction mark, there were individual cases that showed absolutely no yield loss, like they didn't change, and then there was others that had over 50% yield loss. So likewise, further along, if we look at 100% pesticide reduction mark, there was individual cases again that showed no yield loss, and others all the way up to total yield loss, where there was 100%. And this means that even though we can determine an average figure from this data, such as an average yield loss of 15% when pesticides are reduced by 50%, what this average figure is masking is all that variation that can occur in those different scenarios. And what that means for us is that we can't use that figure, that average figure, in an impact analysis, because it would totally underestimate the loss for some situations and overestimate it in others. Just while we're on the topic of variation, we also had a lot of diversity within the study designs of the sources, such as the crop types they looked at and the locations they were done in. So in an effort to reduce the effects of this type of variability, we narrowed down the data set to just the European studies and the ones that looked at the crops more commonly grown in Ireland, such as grains, vegetables, and pastures, and we ran it again. With this refined data set, we still found the same significant relationship with the same large variability. So again, the average figure of yield loss with pesticide reduction, even in a more Irish-like scenario, was not a reliable number to be able to use for our own economic impact analysis.
Okay, so all very significant and really in terms of the overall losses potentially there. But so when you stand back from all that data and you've gone through quite a bit of there in a very short space of time, what would be one kind of main conclusion you'd kind of make or come out of that? And I suppose in that sense, is all of that, if that conclusion, is it applicable to Ireland?
Yep. So the main conclusions from this work is the large knowledge gaps in this area, and not just for Ireland, but other EU member states would be in a similar situation. So ultimately, further empirical research is crucial. The large variation in the data that we do have is too great. So the future research really needs to be cropping system and location specific rather than trying to make a broad estimate work for all situations. So ultimately, while the data does show us that we can expect to see yield losses as pesticide use reduces, this needs to be investigated on a case-by-case basis at a region and crop-specific level for policymakers to really be able to make the best informed decisions.
Okay, and when you do talk about policymakers, I mean, that's your conclusion, certainly from my way of listening to it. I think policymakers all the way across Europe probably need to take heed of this from the point of view of you've looked at a very broad amount of research there that really doesn't point to the fact that we can reduce pesticides by 50% without any great influence on yield or potentially income for farmers.
Yeah. The yield results there, they were majority to show a decrease as I mentioned. So, however, there were instances, 9% in our data, where yield increased with a pesticide reduction. So ultimately, we need to do the further research to see, when this happens, why this happens, and it's very important for the policymakers to have the right information before making policies that could have such a large effect.
Okay, that's brilliant. Listen, that's fantastic research. I think it's brilliant that kind of review has been done. So, Meghan, thanks very much for your time. I really enjoyed your talk at the conference, and we'll hear a little bit now from Robert afterwards in terms of the Irish applicability maybe of some of that work. Thanks again, Meghan.
Nice, thank you, Michael.
Meghan's research was complemented by work from Robert McDougall, who focused on how the loss of pesticides could impact yields on farms. I began by asking Robert why his research was so important and how it connects with Meghan's findings.
We're all aware of the damage that pesticides can do to the environment and to people's health, and that's why the EU has the farm to fork strategy, which amongst a range of other targets is looking to reduce pesticide use. And there's two pesticide related targets in the farm to fork strategy. One is to reduce total pesticide use by 50% by 2030. And the good news on that front is Ireland has more or less achieved that goal. The second pesticide-related target in there is for a 50% reduction in the use of more hazardous substances. And more hazardous substances in this case is classified as chemicals that are candidates for substitution. So, of course, we understand why pesticide reduction targets might be put in place. But on the flip side, pesticides play a very important role in protecting crop yields. Without having pesticides, we probably wouldn't be able to have a global agricultural system that feeds 8 billion people. So what we want to know with this research is what the impacts might be on farming here in Ireland as a result of achieving those pesticide use reduction targets. And as Meghan has outlined, what her research shows is that while there is quite a bit of work out there looking at what happens when pesticide use is reduced, there's a lot of variability in that work, and the results are often very context specific. Ireland has a very unique climate. We're in our own unique climate classification amongst the EU now, and our damp cool conditions are great for producing high cereal yields, but they're also great for producing things like fungal pathogens that can totally ruin a crop. And for that reason, we don't feel that the international data can really accurately predict how things might play out in Ireland. And that's why we're carrying out research to get our own data on the subject.
And as you say, Megan's work kind of showed that international research probably doesn't really fit us terribly well. So, what approach did you take to try and assess what the reductions or how the reductions might impact farmers at ground level?
Yeah, so look, of course, the best way to do this would be to collect real-world empirical data. It would be carry out field trials, test different amounts of chemicals in different cropping systems, and look at a full rotation and all that. Of course, that's going to take years and would be very resource intensive as well. So we wondered what other sources of information there might be out there, and as I mentioned in the previous answer, there hasn't been much in the way of data that's been published for Ireland, but just because people aren't publishing papers doesn't mean no one knows what's going on. We have hundreds of people and maybe thousands of people in Ireland working in the tillage sector, and many of them will have a good idea of how important pest management is and what the effects of different pest management regimes are. So, what we decided to do was to try and tap into that relatively untapped knowledge resource that's out there. And we did this through an iterative expert survey process. So something that's often called a Delphi survey. It's named for the Greek oracle. Basically, it's a way to survey experts on a subject while adding a level of objectivity to that opinion. So the way we went about this, we recruited experts from throughout the Irish tillage sector. We ended up getting 17 people in total to participate, which is a pretty typical number for a study like this. And I should point out that these weren't just Teagasc people. They weren't just academics. These were people from throughout the sector. So people who might be specialist cereal crop advisors, people who might have done trials of this type of thing for private companies, that type of thing. A broad sweep of the tillage sector in Ireland. And we surveyed them anonymously about things like the impacts that this pesticide use reduction might have on yields of cereal crops, about the development of pesticide resistance, and also about the different that we might see between the use of alternative pest management practices and kind of business as usual management. And I noted in there that we surveyed them anonymously. That's a very important part of the Delphi process because it really helps to keep data from getting biased by things like social pressure and the like. Once we'd done that first round of the survey, they sent all their answers back to us. We compiled them into a big summary of what the whole group said, and then sent that back to each participant again so that they could compare their personal response with the group's overall response and revise their answers if they thought it was appropriate. And those second round of revised answers ended up forming the results.
Okay, so if I'm to understand you right, if an expert got this survey, you were asking them a question around for a certain amount of chemistries. If you were to reduce those chemistries, what would happen to the yields or the outcome for a farmer on the ground? And
Yeah, that's
then
correct.
you came back again a second time so that that person could compare their answers to everybody else's answer and give everybody a chance to realign, or maybe they're happy enough to kind of stay where they were in terms of, no, I'm fairly confident this will be the result if we have these reductions.
Yeah, that's correct. So the kind of benefit of a Delphi is it gives people the opportunity to look at things they hadn't previously thought of, because there's a lot of different factors that can come into play in this type of thing. So the idea really is to give the feedback of the whole group to each individual and let that individual rethink their initial answer and go, oh yeah, maybe I forgot about this particular bit there. And then revise their answers based on that. And there's a lot of work being done with this type of methodology over time, and it's been found to be a lot more accurate in predicting things than just a kind of a simple one-round survey might be.
Okay. And what were some of the results you found from the study?
The impacts were predicted to be quite significant. I'll just take the example of winter wheat and look at it under the current management scenario. So this is a scenario where we assume farmers more or less stuck with current management practices, just with less access to pesticides. And under this scenario, the median predictions we got back from the panel was that the reduced use of the hazardous insecticides would reduce yields by around 10%. For fungicides, it was 15%. And for herbicides, over a 10-year period, it was predicted that the impacts would be up to 30% for as a result of the reduced use of herbicides. So quite significant impacts there.
Okay, and was it similar impacts across other barleys and oats as well?
It was relatively similar in barley. Oats, the impact was less significant. Basically, oats are a lot more competitive with weeds, and the herbicide reduction was where the biggest impact came in. So oats actually fare quite a bit better there. Spring crops also fare a bit better as well because they're not in as much direct competition as winter crops.
So you mentioned earlier, and I suppose maybe going back to the linkage back to Meghan's work there, you also asked that panel to identify some of the most effective mitigation measures. Were there any common mitigation methods or strategies that were used across major crops or even pesticide types?
Yeah, there were actually. So the way we asked the panelists about this, for each of the three chemical groups we were interested in, the insecticides, the fungicides, and the herbicides, we gave them a big long list of kind of all the possible integrated pest management techniques that farmers might use to try and mitigate the impacts of using less pesticide. We also told the panelists they could add their own suggestions if there was anything they felt we left out. And then we asked them to rank each one in terms of its importance. While we gave them a very long list, it was interesting to see that the top three most important top three most important techniques for each group of chemicals were actually quite similar. So for both managing the impacts of reduced fungicide and insecticide use, the most important measure was judged to be the use of resistant varieties of crops. So basically a cultivar that can hold off either fungal pathogens or barley yellow dwarf virus in the case of insecticides. For herbicides, the most important technique was considered to be optimized crop rotations, but that was also considered very important for managing fungal pathogens as well. And then the other two techniques that showed up in the top three for the three groups of chemicals were changes in sowing date and the use of decision support services. So I guess something that can help farmers make decisions about where and when to spray and potentially allow them to spray less pesticide, but still get the benefits of controlling the key pests.
So when that question was put to them then in terms of there's an initial finding that there's quite a large yield reduction if you just take away those pesticides or reduce those pesticides. But if you bring back in those IPM actions to try and see whether you can manage the crop better, were the losses as bad as initially thought, or have they dissipated a bit?
The situation improved when we asked our panelists to assume farmers use these integrated pest management techniques, but the impacts didn't entirely disappear. So the example I gave you before of reduced herbicides in winter wheat over the long term, that impact dropped from 30% down to 20%, though that was one of the more extreme impacts on there. As I said before, impacts were lower in oats, impacts were lower in spring crops compared to winter crops. But really, I guess the take-home message is that even with these integrated pest management techniques across the range of crops and seasons and chemical groups that we looked at, the impacts were basically all in the range of 5 to 20% yield loss for each category. Now, these impacts are a bit higher than the few previous studies that have attempted to predict the farm to fork targets. But the reason we carried out these research is that none of those were focused on Ireland. They either looked at the EU as a whole or at a couple of individual member states that didn't include Ireland. So potentially this prediction of higher impacts just shows what I was talking about at the beginning, that Ireland is potentially, due to its climate, particularly vulnerable to the impacts of pests and particularly reliant on certain types of pesticide.
Robert, I can hear already, my ears nearly ringing already, the farmers who are listening to this across the country kind of going, geez, Robert, you're brilliant. You're after that. That's exactly what I thought was going to happen. But that all being said and fine, it's great to be for that work to be carried out. Who's going to listen to it? How will this kind of work be made available to policymakers, or what's the next steps to get this out a little bit further? So I suppose a lot of the EU policymakers have access to this.
to start with, this work was funded by DAFM because they wanted to see what these results were. So that they wanted to know what the impacts would be. They understood the knowledge gap that we were interested in and wanted to get an idea of what the impacts would be. We haven't formally presented our results to them as it's currently undergoing peer review, but they are certainly interested in hearing what we have to say when we finalise these results. And of course, this will be published in peer-reviewed papers, which, of course, policymakers throughout the EU will have access to. So I guess it'll be somewhat up to them with what they do with it. But while this does seem all doom and gloom, and these are obviously some pretty big impacts we're talking about, there are some things within this data that I guess highlights a way forward for us. It should be pointed out that all the chemicals that are on the candidates for substitution list are chemicals that may at some point get deregistered in the future, regardless of what happens with the farm to fork strategy and other targets like that. So this research we feel is useful in that it highlights possibly where we can go to avoid some of these impacts. While it shows that IPM techniques aren't a panacea that solves all our problems, it does show that certain types are potentially quite useful and highlight areas where future investment may be helpful. For example, in support in breeding of resistant varieties of crops, could be an area where there might be potential to, in the future, when we've got a lot more access to more resistant varieties, maybe these impacts wouldn't be as big. Same goes for things like providing support for decision support services for farmers. So things like specialist advisors who can assist them with strategic application of pesticides to, I guess, get the most bang for their buck out of a smaller amount of pesticides. So ultimately these results are pretty significant. But this was predictions we've made based on expert opinion, of course, not on empirical data, but expert opinion that has a relatively high level of confidence behind it. It's there to guide policymakers, and hopefully they will make sensible decisions based on this.
Yeah, no, look, Robert, I think it's fantastic work. I think it's something the industry in Ireland certainly have been looking for a long time, because, as you rightly said at the very start of this, we are different to the rest of Europe. We're wetter, we're under the cost from diseases an awful lot more than across the water, across the continent, I suppose. So it's quite significant, and hopefully, as you say, policymakers will take this on board when putting together new strategies and plans. Robert, as always, thank you very much. Delighted that you could join us, and best of luck in getting the paper across the line in terms of a peer review publication.
Thanks very much, Michael.
A big thanks to Robert and Meghan for joining me on the show to share their insightful research. Next week, we'll have another update from the National Tillage Conference featuring Julia Bondi and Bridget Lynch, who discuss carbon sequestration and reducing nitrogen loss in tillage fields. Looking ahead, there's still plenty of Teagasc events happening next week. The local tillage seminars are scheduled for Ballinabula, Wexford, Portlaoise, Kilkenny, Dublin, Navan and Dundalk. All of these events start at 7:30 p.m. These sessions will cover a wide variety of topics and focus on local challenges. For more details, visit teagasc.ie/events. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.